Okay, so I am going to do a little bit of a demo about how to do a watercolour background. I'm going to use my Hunter Vasa inspired painting that I've got here. Well, this is actually my colour plan, so I had worked out what colours I wanted everything to be before I started doing it. Mainly because watercolours are a little bit more tricky to work with than acrylics in some ways. So with acrylics you can layer on different colours, but with watercolours you have a little bit less flexibility. So I just wanted to make sure that I knew what colour I wanted in each different place. So I'm going to be doing the blue background to begin with today. I'm probably going to make it a little bit darker than that though, because that's a bit pale. So I am going to open my palette. It doesn't matter if you get a palette that's a little bit dirty. All you need to do is just hold your palette like this over your water pots. I'm going to use kind of a chunky size 10 brush just for washing my palettes, but you could use a smaller brush. So I'm just going to start by washing those clean because I was using them earlier. So you can see that the other colours quite quickly come off the colours, so it doesn't take too long. I am getting a little bit of water here, look in the tray, so all I need to do is just pour that in. It's not going to matter too much because I'm going to do blue, but just remember to keep changing your water, because obviously you use the water to mix with the pigment on the palette, and if this is going to get really dirty it's going to affect the colours on your sheet as well. So like I said, just remember to change that every so often. Now I'm going to start with blue. The little brushes are much better for going around the edges of shapes. So I'm going to start by using a slightly smaller brush, and I want it to be quite a nice bright blue, so I'm going to use this blue which is next to the green. This blue which is next to the orange is significantly darker. It's nice, it just has a slightly different hue. A hue is just another word for a shade of a colour. So as I said, I'm going to use this nice one here next to the blue. The more times that I put my paintbrush over the palette and I move it round and round, the brighter it will become. Pressure isn't really important. Don't apply lots of pressure to that because you will end up just breaking the paint. Instead, just repeat that process. So the more times that you do this, the darker and the brighter it will become. Ooh, so I'm going to start by just painting around the earth, and immediately I'm getting a really nice bright blue hue, and that tells me that I've put enough paint on, which is great. I'm just going to carry on painting around some of the main objects. Again, I need a little bit more paint there. You can use the larger brushes if you haven't got fiddly areas that you're trying to paint around, but the larger brushes are quite difficult to get the same level of control. You can see that when I'm putting my paintbrush on and I'm trying to paint around a shape, I want my brush facing the line but going in the same direction as it, and I'm going to spin my paper as I work so that I can always have the paintbrush facing the line but following along in the same direction. Don't try to paint up to lines like this because it's really difficult to kind of stay neatly outside or within that shape. It really is much easier to just do the outlines. The trick is to not let that area dry, because once watercolour dries you will very quickly start to see the edge of that colour. So for example, if I let that dry now, it would be really difficult for me to blend that line out later, so you have to kind of be relatively quick. I'm going to swap to a larger brush now because I'm going to fill in those bigger areas, and again, the more times you put your brush backwards and forwards over the pigment, the dried pigment which is in these palettes, the brighter your colour will become. So I've got a fair bit of water on there. I might need a little bit more pigment so you can see that the colour is becoming quite a lot lighter, and that's fine if that's what you want. Sometimes it's quite nice to have a slightly paler hue as a base layer because it allows you to layer other colours over the top more easily later. So it's up to you how dark you'd like that to be. So I'm just going to continue that process. So you can see that I've gone a little bit wrong there, like I've accidentally painted inside the fire. Don't worry about that. If you are quick, you can get rid of that relatively easily. So you can see I just added a little bit more water, and immediately that area started to go much lighter. If I very gently brush that area with the paintbrush and then dry it on the tissue, you can see that I'm able to remove most of it because I was quick. But if that had dried, I wouldn't be able to remove it so easily. I've got a very kind of subtle hue that's just left on the paper, but it really isn't noticeable. I'm not going to paint around the edge of that now though, because that whole area is wet, and if I start painting here then that's going to bleed. That just means kind of spread into this area, so I'm going to leave that for a moment and I'll come back to that later. It doesn't take long to dry watercolours. That's one of the nice things about working with them. So again, the more times I move my paintbrush over the palette, the brighter the colour will become. I'm going to carefully start painting around the polar bear. Remember to always spin your paper, brush facing the line but following along in the same direction. This is quite a small area, so I'm probably just going to use the smaller brush to fill this whole section in, but I would, as I said, remember to keep changing the two, whether you're outlining areas or whether you're trying to fill large spaces. You will need to stop every so often and just kind of load up your brush again like that. Smaller areas like this, I've got these tiny little kind of spikes on the sun. I'm just going to put my brush inside those and then just pull backwards. And that's the easiest way of kind of painting around fiddly areas. So here, look, you can see I'm just putting my brush inside that and just pulling it backwards, rather than trying to paint along the line like I was doing before. So it really does depend on what kind of area you're doing as to how you use your brush. So now I'm going back to my brush facing the line and following along in the same direction. And again, this area is quite small, so I'll probably just keep this smaller brush for now. Don't worry if you come off the page. Watercolour is actually quite easy to remove from surfaces, such as tables, tabletops and things. So I'm going to just test that fire now, because there's a good chance that that's dry. Yeah, that's not so bad. So again, I'm going to get my brush, I'm facing the line, and just pull it backwards like I was doing around the sun. I'm going to leave that for now, that's still a little bit wet. Okay, and then I'm going to just carry on painting around the edges for a little bit. Be careful when you're working over areas. So you can see, for example, here, this is wet, so I don't want to rest my hand there, so I'm going to be really careful to try and not put my hand in the paint. Instead, I'm resting it on the table, just on the outside. And now I'm going to go back to my slightly bigger brush. Make sure I've got a nice bright colour by moving my brush lots of times over that palette, and then pull that along and fill that space. One of the difficult things about watercolours can be trying to remove the brush strokes. I mean, luckily this area you wouldn't see them too much because of the lines in the background, but if I did want to remove those brush strokes, I would just drop a little bit of water and I would just carefully move my brush around the paper with the brush on its side rather than facing upwards, because you've got a larger contact area with the bristles, and that helps to smooth out those brush strokes. So hopefully you can see that by doing that I've created a much smoother finish. I mean, obviously it's a balance, because the more water you apply, the paler the colour becomes. Sometimes it can be helpful to make the colour a little bit darker than you wanted to, as I said, so that you have got the flexibility to add a little bit more water in. If you've got areas which are puddling and you don't want them to, you can simply dry your brush on a tissue or paper towel, and you can just use the brush. Hopefully you can see what's happening there. That's just kind of sucking up the colour like that, but obviously I don't want that area now showing like a patch, so I'm just going to smooth some of the watercolour paint from the surrounding areas to create a more even finish. Remember, the watercolours are darker when they are wet, so they're going to dry quite a little bit lighter, so just something to bear in mind really. If you want a darker colour, you would need to make it a little bit darker than that, because it is noticeable when it dries. Okay, so these fiddly bits I'm probably going to do just with a blue, just with a small paintbrush. I don't think I'm going to need the big one because they're such small areas. Again, I am still painting my painting with my brush facing the line, but moving in the same direction. When you first start painting your Hundertwasser response, the best thing to do is do the background first. I'm probably not going to do all of that, but I would, yeah, but as I said, the best thing is to just try and get all of your background in focus. Now I'm also going to show you how to ombre. That just means how to fade from one colour to the next. You can achieve that by simply adding a different colour. So for example, if I've got blue and I add red, then I can create a purple, but I can only do that if the blue is already wet. Now, as I didn't finish painting that too long ago, I'm going to see if I can just pop a little bit of red on the top and see what will happen. So if I put a little bit of red along the top, hopefully you can see that in some areas that's already started to turn purple. So all I'm doing is I'm just blending that down slowly, gradually with my big brush, but I'm using my brush on the side so I get quite a lot of contact with the paper. And hopefully you can see that that is now creating a more of a purple sky. Obviously, as I said, because I already had the blue and now I've mixed the red on top. And that is quite nice. But that's not the only way to do it. So you can also add the colours separately. Here's one I made earlier, as they say. So this time I'm going to approach that in a slightly different way. This time I'm going to put the blue and the red next to each other. So you can create ombre or a fade by using more than two colours. But I'm just going to demo the blue and the red for now. So if I start by putting some blue stripes here, and then if I put some a red stripe at the top, and then I'm going to, well, actually I'm probably going to bring those a little bit closer, bring those colours closer. Then run your paintbrush with a tiny bit of water between those two colours, and you can see that they blend really nicely. This only really works if you use harmonious colours, so colours which are next to each other on the colour wheel. Be really careful about trying to create an ombre or a faded effect with colours which aren't next to each other, because it's really easy to make brown. Obviously when you mix all of the three primaries together you do get brown. So because red and purple and blue are next to each other, this works really well. If you want your colours to be a little bit more vibrant, as long as they're still wet, you can drop those colours straight in. If it is dry, however, and you think, oh, when it does dry, you think, oh, that really wasn't how I wanted it to look, you absolutely can put another layer on, but it would be difficult to completely change the colours underneath. So you can see now that with this next layer of colour, it is becoming a lot brighter and a lot bolder. So I'm going to just add that blue in there. And I'm just going to bring that, and I'm just going to mix that over there. And that, as I said, creates kind of quite a nice sunset. So it's two different ways of doing it. Personally, I think the way that I've just demoed is creates a slightly nicer, more dramatic impact. The wet on wet creates a subtler outcome. It really just does depend what you're after. One thing to remember, which is really important, don't overwork an area. So if your paper becomes oversaturated, that just means if it has too much water on, it's going to be really easy for you to damage the paper. So I'm deliberately putting quite a lot of water on here, but I'm also moving my brush backwards and forwards repeatedly across the same area, which is a really different motion to what I was doing before. So before I was using kind of very slow, kind of steady motions, and now I'm moving my paintbrush quite quickly. And you can see that all these little bubbles have started to appear on the paper. Essentially what's happening is I'm rubbing the surface of the paper, and that's not what you want to happen. If you were to carry on doing that, you would actually make a hole in the paper. My advice to you is, if you see these little bubbles, just stop working that area immediately. You can come back to it when it's dry, and you can just brush those bubbles off. But as I said, do stop working on your painting as soon as you see these. But hopefully try and avoid them.